Hello, my name is Kenneth Tingey. I'm recording this story, this history, on April 15th, 2013, and I'm doing it very informally, as I said I would do so, but I felt with regard to activities in Utah for reform and development, that it was useful and actually very important to understand some elements of Utah's history in this regard, and what I believe to be the legacy that we've been left in terms of similar kinds of reforms in prior times. I think that there isn't really general knowledge of our heritage in this regard, and I think that is something that's challenging to us as we look at developments not only here but in other parts of the world where change and reform is needed. I think that there's some general agreement that there's significant need for change in the health area, and there are other areas in society and in the economy where this is the case. So I thought I'd just lay this down informally, and I believe that probably the main issue at hand here is to understand the history of the Eccles family. People in Utah see the Eccles name, particularly at the universities, but throughout our society and culture, we see the various contributions that are made by this family and other groups that were associated with them, but we don't really know the story. And since I was young, growing up in Logan, I've always been interested in, I don't know, to me, the kind of the romance of development and economic development and entrepreneurship and all. And I was raised right close to where the Eccles lived, at least the Logan family, and learned over time. I've collected various works that talk about the Eccles history. One was, I've got a copy somewhere that I can't find right now, of David Eccles. It was a biography of him by Leonard Arrington, who was also a Loganite and really a renowned historian. He did a really great history of David. And that was published by USU Press, Utah State University Press. Then Marriner, who was one of David's many children, was quite an entrepreneur. And I noted when I lived in California, being largely a bookaholic, I ran across a book. This is one by Jonathan Hughes. This is called The Vital Few. And there's an extensive chapter in this book. This is The Entrepreneur in American Economic Progress. This is published by Oxford University Press. There's an extensive chapter on Marriner Eccles, and here it refers to him as a logician in Wonderland, referring to him as an entrepreneur working in the context of public-private activity, not just a private entrepreneur. There's also an excellent biography by Sidney Hyman of Marriner Eccles, called Marriner Eccles. This was published by Stanford University Press in the 70s, and it might have even been when he was alive. I think he died in 76. There are a few other things that are available. In fact, I actually ordered, it's not particularly cheap, but there's some, all of these works are out of print, but there's except for maybe The Vital Few, I don't know. There's an autobiography written by Marriner Eccles called Beckoning Horizons or something, which I just now ordered on Amazon, and a number of things that I'm going to talk about are quoted from that book. There's also Professor Israelson, I think it's Dwight Israelson, that's an economics professor at Utah State, that includes some materials about Marriner Eccles in some of his courses. And I have that that course pack somewhere in my library as well. So those are the basic sources. Plus I've learned a little bit about the history from oral history from various people I've talked to about this. And so I'm going to recount mostly the history of Marriner, but a little bit about David and what I think this has to do with Utah and the legacy we have in Utah for reform and entrepreneurship, as well as the opportunity we have as we face issues large and small in our time. I'll start with the story of Marriner at one point, and I'll go back and talk about David and even William, who was David's father, in the course of my chat. Marriner Eccles, about 100 years ago, I'm speaking in 2013, so this is about 100 years ago, he was returning from a mission, an LDS mission to Scotland, recently returned, and was working up in a Blacksmith Fork Canyon, which is a canyon just east of Hiram in Cache Valley. He was working on a family project, a hydrology project. They had a dam up there and they were generating electricity. He learned while he was working on that project of his father's death. Now, David had been a pioneer entrepreneur and had been involved in a variety of different enterprises in a variety of different industries, and was living in, he had a family, he had two families, a polygamous family. The first family was in Ogden and the second family was in Logan. There were a number of children, I don't remember exactly how many, but they were 7 to 9 children, something in that range in each family. And the older son was named David as well, and then Marriner was the oldest son in the Logan family. So Marriner learned of David's death and was ready, willing, and eager to help with the reorganization or the understanding of the various enterprises. As far as I know in the record, there really wasn't even a document that showed all of David Eccles' interests, all of the companies that he was involved in. And his pattern was to own a fairly small percentage of a variety of companies. And I think, and a lot of this is all of this is from memory, it's about 17 to 20 companies that he had a significant interest in. But in all of them, he had a minority interest, and he was also involved in banking in a number of these companies. He would involve himself with people that were directly involved on a day-to-day basis in managing these companies, and then he would take on a financial role and an advisory role. David would. Now, Marriner, after the funeral and the other activities, family activities at David's death, he went to a board meeting in Ogden of the family interests. Now, since Marriner, his mother was the second family, a polygamous family, she was not a legal wife at that point, given the change of status in the law when Utah adopted statehood. And so she did not receive an inheritance. So, and once again, this is from memory, even decades ago that I read this, but half the estate went to the mother in Ogden, and I'm sorry to say I don't remember her name. And then the rest of the estate was divided equally among the children, and the children in the Logan family did receive an equal portion of their inheritance. But they ended up with quite a minority position, the various Logan members of the family. And David Jr. Was in charge as being the oldest son in the first family in the first meeting. So there was a meeting in Ogden. The various board members and other participants in the Eccles enterprise were there. Marriner went to the meeting representing the interests of the Logan family, and David Jr. kicked him out of the meeting. He said he had no right to be there. So Marriner was ejected from that meeting. And as it turned out, the other participants in the enterprises really didn't know Marriner. Marriner had been on a mission, of course, but most of his activity had been up in Oregon. He'd spent a lot of time with his father in the forest interests there, and in the lumber interests. So a lot of the people in Ogden didn't even know Marriner. Now Marriner was apprised of what he considered to be financial anomalies and things that the Ogden family had done that weren't appropriate. So he immediately, once he was kicked out of the meeting, he got on the train and went up to Oregon and talked to the accountant there, who he knew very well, and was able to bring the books back to Ogden. He demonstrated to the people there the problem, and there was a change of affairs, and Marriner was put in charge and David was relegated to the side bench. And over that period of time, there had been some problems in the companies, and some of the interests were facing bankruptcy and other problems. Marriner, now his only schooling was at the Brigham Young College, which was located now where Logan High School is. Brigham Young College was a preparatory school in large part for teachers. It was analogous to the Brigham Young Academy down in Provo, but it was involved in teacher preparation and basically a high school education. In the late 20s, the Brigham Young College was subsumed into Utah State University, and much of the College of Education at Utah State University owes its genealogy or its heritage to Brigham Young College. But that's where Marriner had gone to school. And his younger son George had gone to Columbia, had an undergraduate there, did not go on an LDS mission. And in these first stages, I'm not sure if George was on the scene or if he was already off in college. There's S.I. Quinney, was also from Logan, a young man who had gone to Harvard for his legal education. He became the attorney for the Eccles boys, for Marriner and George. So Marriner went from company to company and helped to reorganize them, helped to put them back on their feet, and he also took over management of the financial affairs, not only the members of his family, but many, if not most, of the members of the Ogden family. And there was not a falling out. I think that they continued to have good relations, to my knowledge, even with David. But Spencer was one of the other sons in that family. But Marriner was able to right the ship. He was able to turn these companies around. He and George in particular put together the banking interests, and over the next 15 years or so, they turned a fledgling banking system into a pretty powerful banking network, which was ultimately known as First Security Bank. But they had dozens of banks, and with I think his name was Steve Quinney, they developed a concept which they called the bank holding concept, and I think historically they're held to have invented the bank holding concept at First Security, and were successful in bringing these various banks together. I think to understand the dual nature of the Eccles activities, both with companies and banks, it's interesting and important to understand David Eccles' history, and even the history of William, who was David's father. William Eccles was an individual in Scotland, I believe it was Glasgow, who was functionally blind. And he had a large family. His oldest son was David. He had quite a number of other children. He was converted to the LDS faith in Glasgow. They lived there in a state of poverty. The income that the family had was from William's work with a lathe. He was functionally blind, but he could work with a wood lathe, and with that lathe he would make utensils, spoons, forks, and other utensils, kitchen utensils. That was the basis for the family income. When they came to Utah, they were assigned to go to Eden, which is a small town in Ogden Valley, up in the upper reaches of the valley, which is east of Ogden. And Ogden Valley is a beautiful valley. Eden is a beautiful place, but it's a small place, a very agricultural place, and not a good situation for the Eccles family. William was a forthright, believing member of the church, and he felt that that was the place for them to be. They were able to sell some of their utensils to some of the neighbors, but they were really on the edge in terms of their existence. I think they had some small farming activity. David, I think by the time he was 14 years old, tells the story of taking a bag of wheat down from Eden, down through the canyon, and into Ogden, and he went to a mill to have the wheat ground. This is during the winter, to have the wheat ground so that they could have bread. And he was told by the people in the mill that they were scheduled out for weeks and months, that they couldn't, that there wasn't any time to deal with his wheat. So he sat on the stoop of the door and just waited. And I think within I don't remember exactly how long, but within some reasonable period of time, they said, "Come on in," and they did his wheat for him. He then carried the wheat back up the canyon from Ogden up to Eden, and he said it was fighting through the deep snow with the wheat. He was determined at some point to build a railroad up that canyon, which, to my knowledge, he did later. He got back up. They were living with this situation where there were limited prospects. They learned, or they heard through relatives, that there were opportunities in Oregon to earn money in forests and in lumberjack work. And so David, with I think possibly other members of the family, I don't recall, but not the whole family, went to Oregon and looked at the situation, found that there was work to be done, initiated his work activity, and had some measure of success. He came back. The whole family decided to go to Oregon for the time being to follow up on this opportunity. By this time, the family was, for the most part, destitute. They walked from Utah up to Oregon. There was a point in the trek that they came across a forest fire, and they didn't have any other recourse but to walk through the forest fire. And by this time, they didn't have shoes, or they had negligible foot protection. And so in the story, it mentions that they had to cross some pretty gnarly conditions in that forest fire with their feet in the coals, etc. So in Oregon, they had a measure of success. After they got enough resources, the family decided to move back to Ogden. So the family moved back to Ogden. David stayed for a period of time. Then he returned to Ogden, and he'd saved up, I think the number was $600. With this $600, he entrusted that money with his mother. And then he went up to Ogden Valley and up above the valley, and he had some partners. I think one of those partners was named Stoddard. And they were going to start to harvest lumber in Utah. And the point was to harvest the lumber in Utah to send to the Midwest, Kansas, Iowa, etc., because there was a great deal of growth there, but there wasn't lumber. And so they started their work, and David started working with the Stoddards and the others. He came down to Ogden. He wanted to invest. He had the $600. Unfortunately, when he got back to Ogden, he found that his sister had become engaged to, I don't know, I guess you'd say a flim-flam man, a handsome suitor, and that the $600 had been spent on their wedding and related activities, and it was gone. And David was more than perplexed that this had happened, that his mother had shown this lack of judgment, and he vowed at that point that he would manage the money himself in the future. And by the same token, he went back up to the mountain. He told them what had happened, and they were able, because of his industry and because of his contribution, they were able to work out an arrangement where he had his partnership in spite of that problem. Well, they got involved. David was a very interesting person, virtually no education. But he was talented in business. He became partners with quite a number of people that later on, or due to this, became famous. One was Charles Nibley, who eventually was the presiding bishop of the LDS Church, and many others. So he had a great deal of prosperity. He got involved in the railroading business, construction, got involved with milk, and got involved with a variety of different businesses, lumber. But also in retailing lumber. So quite a number of companies that continue to exist in Utah had some involvement, and so he was principally involved in developing, I would say, a couple of dozen highly successful companies in Utah. And by the time he died, about 100 years ago, as I related earlier, when Marriner was up Blacksmith Fork Canyon, he was worth, I think the estimate was $14 million. Excuse me. And that's when $1 million was worth a lot more than it is now. On the side, it's interesting to learn that by tradition, it's understood that David Eccles learned how to add, but he never actually learned how to subtract. And that's been considered to be an interesting idea that's not unrelated to his entrepreneurial success. Now, jumping back to Marriner, by the late 20s, Marriner and his brother George and the others had been quite successful, not only in bringing the Eccles companies into profit, but also the banking system. They had several dozen banks, regional banks in each town in the West, and were quite prosperous. They moved their activity from Logan first to Ogden, and the rationale for that was it's the advantage and the bane of Cache Valley is that it is separated from the rest of the state, and it is separated geographically from much of the transportation and communication infrastructure. So it made sense to go to Ogden first from a railroad standpoint, but from a general standpoint in terms of communication, etc., it made sense for them eventually to relocate to Salt Lake City. So their main operations were in Salt Lake City in the late 1920s. Now, by the time of the 1920s, 1929, 1930, there had been the stock market crash. There had been the failure of quite a number of enterprises, including many of the clients of the Eccles. The Eccles themselves were well-to-do. But Marriner, in his book, said that these times were very difficult times for him personally, in part because he felt so helpless. During the day, he said that as a banker, he had assumed a kind of a stoic or a attitude, or an attitude of confidence, but when he went home at night, he said he felt extremely helpless to know what to do. I think it's interesting to consider that from a regional standpoint in the Intermountain area, the Eccles were essentially functioning as central bankers. They understood the economy with a level of practicality probably that was quite rare, because the economy was somewhat insulated from the rest of the world during this period of time, and because they owned the banks or controlled the banks, the Eccles were very much aware of the various flows of money and the effect of loaning money or investing money in the region. By Marriner Eccles' own report, during this period of time in the late 20s, as he was contemplating this problem, he relates this as being an answer to meditation and even of prayer, that the conclusion or the resolution of the problem came to him, that the problem of the depression could really only be resolved by government. And the way for government to resolve this problem was to organize works projects, to give people work to do, to give them money that they could spend, and thus to stimulate the economy. Now, you'll all recognize this basic idea as a Keynesian idea. But this is an idea that from what I understand from my readings and the activities and the histories, that Keynes didn't really publish this idea until the mid-30s with his general theory, which I have somewhere. And that Marriner Eccles started talking about this in 1929 and 1930. Well, there became word in the East of this banker in the West that was making these suggestions that were very uncommon and really considered to be quite radical. The thing that bothered the people in the East was that Marriner Eccles, in making these statements, was a banker. He was a Republican. He was of the most conservative class of the country. And he was making these statements that there needed to be work projects and that there needed to be stimulus to give people jobs, etc. He was in contact with groups in Washington. In fact, there was a time when from the Treasury Department they sent somebody out to talk with him, and I don't recall right now who this was, but that person talked with Marriner in the coffee shop at Hotel Utah. And Marriner told some of these ideas, and he said, "We need to come and talk to Congress." What happened was that Marriner already was scheduled to talk to the Senate on some banking issues. He was scheduled to go out to Washington, and so he extended his stay in Washington and talked about these other various activities and these other suggestions. He talked to people in the FDR administration. He talked to people, Republicans as well as Democrats, about these ideas. And once again, it created quite a stir because people weren't used to hearing that kind of thing from an established banker. Well, not long after that, he got the call that they wanted him to come to Washington. And I think it's very interesting, and this is an important lesson with regard to the economy, I think, in Utah, and the idea of reform, that Marriner was busily going about his business when he was contacted by Washington and they wanted him to come back and to consider these issues more. What he was doing was working, actually he was on a train coming back from Nevada to Utah when he got the word to come to Washington. This is as I recall. What he was doing in Nevada was he was the chairman of the consortium of the 6 companies building Hoover Dam at the time. Now, as you think about the history, I started out with the story of what Marriner Eccles was doing when he returned from his mission when his father died. He was working on a hydroelectric project in Blacksmith Fork Canyon. Now, of course, in the meantime, he was involved in developing the banks and developing the various companies. One of the companies that the Eccles participated in and had a major ownership in was a company that was called Utah Construction Company. And Utah Construction Company was organized in the early days to build railroad facilities, because the Eccles were involved, as well as the Thatchers and others in the region. They were involved in building railroads. Well, Utah Construction Company had grown under the supervision and leadership of Marriner Eccles from a small regional company to a significant enterprise. The 6 companies were the large construction companies of the West Coast, and Marriner Eccles had led out in that process, and he led out in he really followed the logic of what needed to be done in terms of water reclamation in the West, and was doing a really remarkable thing in the management and oversight of the building of Hoover Dam. This is an example, I believe, of taking a concept, of working through that concept and not compromising on the fundamental elements of this. So as Marriner was returning on the train to Salt Lake City, he accepted the calling to go back to Washington, D.C. Now, the net effect was Marriner went to Washington, D.C. He was there from the early 30s until the Truman administration. He first worked under the Treasury Department. Morgenthau was the head of Treasury, as I recall, and he worked in a political capacity there. He put his activity in Utah on hold and under the supervision of George, his younger brother, and was involved 18-hour days for probably, 21 years, something like that. By the mid-30s, he was a major element in the economic planning programs of the work projects, worked directly with FDR, worked directly with Treasury, and it wasn't long before he was appointed to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve building in Washington, D.C. is the Marriner Eccles building, and he was considered over this period of time to be a very strong Fed chair. I read in one sense that the strong Fed chairmen over time were Volcker and Eccles, as well as possibly Alan Greenspan. But he was a strong chairman of the Fed. And his efforts in public service lasted through the Depression, lasted through the World War II period, and Marriner was directly involved in many of the negotiations that resulted in founding of the World Bank, the Bretton Woods Agreement, and the post-war structures that were designed to ensure the peace and to provide similar kinds of opportunities around the world that had been provided in the United States during the Depression. Marriner was esteemed very highly in a Democratic administration, although he retained his Republican affiliation, and was considered to be very successful. In '51, it turned out that he had a strong personality, as well as Truman. He and Harry Truman didn't really get along, and so he resigned his post at the Federal Reserve and returned to Utah. So from 1951, I believe, until the mid-'70s, Marriner functioned in Utah. He worked to fortify the activities, the First Security Bank. He worked to strengthen the various companies. He lived in Hotel Utah during that period of time. And by the mid-'70s, he had not only consolidated the success and activities of these various companies, but he had employed a vision that he had developed in terms of the good and the benefit of the people of Utah. He had some children, I think it was 3. His marriage to his first wife did not survive the long hours in Washington. In part, his first wife, did not enjoy the environment in Washington. So there was a divorce. I think it was, for the most part, an amicable divorce. He had 2 or 3 children, I don't recall right now. He remarried a woman from the East Coast, and they lived in Hotel Utah for the 20 some odd years, the remainder of his life. He worked with the law firm, with Ray Quinney. He worked with the banks, and was particularly successful in the consolidation of Utah Construction Company, and ultimately he sold Utah Construction Company to General Electric. At this time, he had not only been managing his money, but had been managing the money of the various members of the family. And by the mid-70s, with his leadership, quite a number of foundations were organized to the betterment of the people of Utah. This is pretty much the details of this are outlined in the Hyman book. But the basic idea of these foundations was that the money would be distributed principally to public universities in the state of Utah that had a research orientation, which by default really boils down to the University of Utah and Utah State University. So certain proportions of the funds of these foundations were legally required to be distributed to these institutions. And a proportion were to be distributed to the institutions and to other organizations in Utah for the betterment of Utah's culture. So since the mid-70s, when the foundations were organized, these funds have been made available on a regular basis from these various Eccles foundations. Now these are the results of the effort that principally Marriner put forth in the Utah Construction Company and in the other companies. Anderson Lumber was one, and there are many. So these funds have really served Utah in a number of ways, and this really leads to the ubiquity of the Eccles name in northern Utah in general and throughout the state. It also, I think, provides an interesting example to us of the people of Utah of the capabilities that we have by following this line of reasoning. The line of reasoning that first David Eccles demonstrated, and then that Marriner Eccles followed through with, and that is to not really compromise on the important issues. For example, in terms of the water reclamation issue, whatever it was that Marriner learned in Little Blacksmith Fork Canyon, I think gave him some groundings to provide leadership, not only in terms of the technologies and the engineering requirements of these kinds of projects, but also leadership in terms of finance, accounting, project management, etc. Little Blacksmith Fork River led to reclamation of the Colorado River. Now, another example is the example of the banks. There were a number of different banks that existed, and the real question was how to provide a general organization of these banks in conjunction with the Ray Quinney firm, with his brother George. They came up with a very innovative idea. Now, once again, with the issue of the works projects and the problem of the Depression. Now, there were some work projects in process already, but not at all to the scale that Marriner was recommending. He was recommending very large-scale projects. And of course, very large-scale projects did take place. And in many cases, these projects were used for land reclamation. They were used for water reclamation. They were used to provide infrastructure that served us these 70 years since that time. Once again, Marriner with his knowledge as a de facto central banker in the Intermountain region, and with his knowledge of operational requirements and of finance, he was able to exert significant leadership. Now, we might say on a national scale and even on an international scale, what might have occurred had he not entered the scene when he did. Then I think finally the question of the organization of these assets and his, I think, overwhelming wisdom and charity in dedicating these assets from the various Eccles foundations, these various organizations, to the betterment of the people of the state of Utah and of the nation. Without question, for many decades, we have benefited. I think that he showed great vision in tying up the disposition of these funds actually legally, so that they were required to be spent for these various purposes in these organizations. The scientific base of activities at the University of Utah, at Utah State University, Weber College, even in the smaller colleges, and there's been significant overlap and disposition at Brigham Young University and other institutions, local institutions, I think point to the fact that we have a distinct advantage at this time, and we have been greatly blessed from the commitment and wisdom of David and Marriner. Now, I've voiced my opinion that we're very quiet on the subject of Marriner Eccles and his contributions in particular. I've made suggestions, for example, that there is a distinct lack of bronze in his image on the Utah State University campus. And I think that probably would extend to other parts of our area. Now, we have obviously a unique environment due to the founding and the leadership of the LDS Church in Utah. Obviously, this is a definitional aspect of living in this region. I think that the integrity, the work ethic, the tenacity imposed by the Eccles, both David and Marriner and others in the family, Spencer and this generation, come from that heritage. I think that there's no doubt of that. One more thing that I'll mention that I think is a lot of fun. David Eccles achieved a measure of success even while his father William was alive, and they were able to fund some investigative medical work with regard to William's blindness, and they found that he had a severe case of cataracts, and they were able to remove those cataracts, and for the last 20 years or so of William's life, David's father, he was able to see. And I think that's a fun and exciting aspect of their history. In terms of the history of the Eccles, I have touched on a few aspects of that history, but it's amazing and wonderful. I think that the youth in particular of Utah should know that history and understand that heritage, which is a part of their own heritage, and that we really help to address the concept of leadership and the contribution that people from our society and culture can make. Now, we have one challenge in that the Eccles were able to, in many ways, act on a tabla rasa, tabla blanca, a blank slate, whereas they didn't necessarily see a lot of resistance to their ideas because they were dealing in an unclaimed desert. Now, that's not necessarily the case with regard to the works projects, because that was inclusive of the entire country. But we do have to function in an area where reforms and activities may go against the grain and some of the financial interests of powerful groups in our region and elsewhere. That's one of the great challenges that's faced when reform takes place in any regard. But I'd say that one of the great messages that we can learn from the history of the Eccles, and I would say most particularly Marriner Eccles, is that you can make a difference by not compromising, by sticking to the logic of what makes sense, what needs to be done. In many cases, he showed that success can be achieved. We continue to benefit from the largesse of the Eccles family and of the success of that period, and the other families, the Quinneys and others that were involved with that process. But we are in dire need of entrepreneurism, of innovation, public-private cooperation, and in finding fundamental resolution to the problems that face us in health and in other areas. And I bring forth this example of the history of the Eccles as an example of what might be done, what we might do in our time. Thank you very much for your time, and if you feel so inclined, I'll provide information as to my contact information so that we might have a discourse on the subject, and I anticipate this will be one of many video tapes on this history. There are many others that participated in this growth and this development that warrant discussion. And of course, my belief is that the history of the Eccles would make for a great triple trilogy. I think that this history is no less exciting and no less eventful from the Lord of the Rings and others, and it benefits from the fact that it actually happened. Thank you very much.